I am Augusta, 30 years old, and I have always been the black sheep of my wealthy family. From choosing art over the family business to speaking my mind at dinner parties, I never quite fit the Montgomery mold. But nothing prepared me for the day of my grandmother's will reading when my mother stood up and announced to everyone, "Ungrateful ones are not allowed here." I felt my heart shatter until the family lawyer said something that changed everything. Before I share how my entire family life unraveled that day, let me know where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button if you've ever felt like the outsider in your own family. The Montgomerys are what people call old money. Our family fortune dates back 4 generations with investments in everything from real estate to technology. Our estate in Connecticut has been featured in architectural magazines, and our name appears regularly on donor walls at museums and hospitals throughout the Northeast. To the outside world, we represented success class and dignity. My mother, Eleanor Montgomery, was the perfect society woman. With her impeccable appearance, charity board memberships, and social connections, she navigated our privileged world with practiced ease. My father, James, was more reserved, but equally committed to maintaining the family legacy through his work at Montgomery Investments. My siblings followed the expected path. William, my older brother, joined the family business after getting his MBA from Wharton, while Catherine, my younger sister, married into another prominent family and dedicated herself to social causes that looked good on paper. Then there was me, Augusta Montgomery, the disappointment. From an early age, I showed more interest in paintbrushes than profit margins. While my siblings attended cotillions and sailing lessons, I would sneak away to sketch landscapes and people. This might have been dismissed as a childish phase, if not for my grandmother, Margaret Montgomery, who saw something in my passion that no one else did. "You have a gift, Augusta," she would tell me while examining my childish drawings. "Never let anyone convince you it's not valuable." Grandmother Margaret was different from the rest of them. Though she had the same refined mannerisms and social standing, there was always a twinkle in her eye that suggested she found much of high society ridiculous. She had married into the Montgomery fortune, coming from a more modest background herself, and never fully adopted the family's obsession with status. Our bond grew over countless afternoons in her private sitting room, where she kept an impressive collection of art books. She would show me works by the masters telling stories about the artists' lives that textbooks glossed over. "Did you know Monet was ridiculed by critics when he first exhibited his work?" she once told me. "People thought his paintings were just messy blobs. Now those messy blobs sell for millions. Remember that when someone doesn't understand your vision." When I announced my intention to attend art school instead of pursuing a business degree, my parents were horrified. My mother's face had turned a shade of red I'd never seen before. "You want to throw away generations of privilege and opportunity to become a starving artist? This is how you repay everything we've given you," she had shouted. My father had simply looked disappointed, which somehow hurt worse than my mother's rage. My siblings exchanged glances that clearly communicated they thought I had lost my mind. Only Grandmother Margaret supported me. She not only encouraged my decision, but secretly helped pay for my education when my parents reduced my allowance as punishment. What my family didn't know was that she regularly visited my small art studio in Brooklyn, purchasing supplies and checking on my progress. "They'll come around eventually," she would assure me, though her tone suggested she didn't entirely believe it herself. They never did come around. After graduation, I established a modest career as an artist, selling enough work to support myself, but never achieving the kind of success that might have impressed my family. My mother referred to my profession as my hobby whenever it came up in conversation, and my invitations to exhibitions were met with polite excuses from everyone except Grandmother. What hurt most was learning years later that she had attended several of my shows incognito, wearing a scarf and sunglasses, afraid that being seen openly supporting me would cause more family conflict. She had even purchased some of my pieces through dealers so my family wouldn't know. Our relationship remained close, despite the geographic and emotional distance from the rest of my family. We spoke weekly by phone, and I visited her whenever I could escape the demands of my studio. As she aged, these visits became more important. In her final year, as her health declined, I was the one who visited her most frequently at the hospital. During one of our last conversations, she held my hand with surprising strength for someone so frail. "Augusta," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've always admired your courage to live authentically. So few people do you know. They're too afraid of disapproval. I learned it from you," I told her, fighting back tears. She smiled mysteriously. "The truth will set things right, my dear. Remember that." I didn't understand what she meant at the time. 3 days later, she slipped away peacefully in her sleep. I was devastated, having lost not only my grandmother, but my strongest ally in a family that had never understood me. Grandmother Margaret's funeral was exactly what you would expect from a prominent family. Elaborate, well-attended, and as much a social event as a memorial. The Montgomery name ensured that local politicians, business associates, and members of the social elite filled the historic church to capacity. My mother oversaw every detail, from the selection of flowers to the order of the procession, ensuring it properly reflected the family's standing. I arrived early, wearing a simple black dress that I knew my mother would deem insufficient for the occasion. As predicted, she looked me up and down when I entered, her disapproval evident. "Couldn't you have made more of an effort, Augusta? This isn't one of your gallery openings," she whispered sharply before turning to greet a state senator with a warm, practiced smile. Throughout the service, I sat in the front row with my family, feeling like an imposter. The eulogies from family friends and business associates described a woman I barely recognized. They spoke of Margaret Montgomery, the society matron and philanthropist, not the grandmother who had smuggled art supplies to me and laughed at the pretentiousness of charity galas. When it came time for family remembrances, my mother spoke eloquently about my grandmother's dedication to family traditions and values. My brother described her business acumen and commitment to preserving the family legacy. I had prepared some words about her compassion and creativity, but when I approached the podium, my mother subtly shook her head. "I think we've heard enough family tributes," she announced to the congregation. "Margaret wouldn't want us to dwell in sorrow. Let's move on to the minister's final blessing." I returned to my seat, clutching my unread notes, as whispers circulated through the audience. Later, at the reception in our family home, I overheard conversations questioning my presence. "I'm surprised she showed up at all," said one of my mother's friends, not realizing I was within earshot. "Eleanor says they haven't spoken in months." "Well, she probably heard about Margaret's estate and decided to make an appearance," replied another. Their assumption stung, but I wasn't surprised. In my family's world, genuine emotion always took a back seat to material considerations. As guests mingled in the main house, I slipped away to my grandmother's private study. Unlike the rest of the mansion, with its formal museum-like quality, her space was comfortable and lived in. Bookshelves overflowed with volumes on art, philosophy, and history. Her desk remained as she had left it, with notes in her elegant handwriting and a half-finished letter. I ran my fingers along the spines of her beloved books, remembering how she would read passages to me when I was younger. Opening her desk drawer, I found a small envelope with my name written on it. Inside was a simple note that read, "Look beyond appearances, Augusta. Not everything is as it seems." The cryptic message left me puzzled. Was this something she had prepared before her death, or just an old note I was never meant to find? Before I could contemplate further, I heard a knock on the door. "Miss Augusta, I'm Lawrence Peterson, your grandmother's attorney," said an older gentleman with kind eyes and a formal demeanor. "I don't believe we've met before." "No, we haven't," I replied quickly, tucking the note into my pocket. He studied me with curious intensity. I wanted to introduce myself before tomorrow's will reading. Your grandmother spoke of you often. Something in his tone suggested there was more he wanted to say, but my mother appeared in the doorway, interrupting our conversation. Mr. Peterson, there you are. I believe we still have some details to discuss for tomorrow, she said, giving me a pointed look that clearly communicated I should leave. As I exited, Mr. Peterson called after me. I'll see you tomorrow at 11, Miss Augusta. That night, back in my small hotel room near the family estate, I debated whether to attend the will reading at all. I had no expectations of receiving anything significant, and subjecting myself to more family tension seemed pointless. I was about to call Mr. Peterson to decline when my phone rang. Augusta, it's Mrs. Jenkins. The voice of our family's longtime housekeeper was immediately recognizable, though we hadn't spoken in years. Mrs. Jenkins, how are you? I asked, genuinely pleased to hear from the woman who had often snuck me cookies when my mother had sent me to my room without dinner. I'm well, dear. I'm calling because, well, I wanted to make sure you're coming tomorrow. I'm not sure it's worth the trouble, I admitted. We both know my mother would prefer I stay away. There was a pause before she continued, her voice lowered. Your grandmother made sure you would be protected. That's all I can say. But please, come tomorrow. It's important. Her cryptic statement echoed my grandmother's note. What was going on? After promising to attend, I spent a restless night reviewing my relationship with my family, wondering if I was setting myself up for more disappointment. The next morning, I dressed carefully in a tailored black suit, the most formal outfit I owned, and prepared myself for confrontation. Whatever happened, I would face it with the dignity my grandmother had always modeled. The Montgomery Family Library had always intimidated me as a child. 2 stories of leather-bound books, dark wood paneling, and oil paintings of stern ancestors created an atmosphere of solemn judgment. It seemed fitting that this would be where my grandmother's final wishes would be revealed. By the time I arrived, the rest of the family was already seated around the massive oak table. My mother sat at the head with my father to her right, and my siblings beside him. Several distant cousins and my grandmother's sister occupied the remaining chairs. The only empty seat was at the far end of the table, distanced from everyone else, clearly intended for me. Mr. Peterson stood near a podium organizing his documents, occasionally glancing at me with that same curious expression from the day before. My mother was already in performance mode, dabbing at invisible tears, while simultaneously checking her watch. Now that everyone has finally arrived, she said with a pointed look in my direction, perhaps we can begin. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming today. We're here to execute the last will and testament of Margaret Eleanor Montgomery. Before we begin, I want to explain that Mrs. Montgomery updated her will 6 months ago with several specific instructions about today's proceedings. My mother frowned slightly at this information, but quickly composed her features. The reading began with standard formalities and expressions of sound mind. Then came the distributions: jewelry to cousins, specific artworks to friends, charitable donations to organizations my grandmother had supported throughout her life. My mother received the family pearls and some antique furniture. My father got my grandfather's watch collection. William inherited some investment properties in Boston, and Catherine received a vacation home in Maine. With each bequest, I grew increasingly uncomfortable. My name hadn't been mentioned once, confirming what I had suspected. I had been essentially disinherited. I could feel my mother's smug glances and my siblings' pitying looks. I kept my expression neutral, determined not to show how much it hurt. After nearly an hour of distributions, Mr. Peterson paused and adjusted his glasses. Before I continue to the final and most significant portion of the will, Mrs. Montgomery included a special provision. He pulled out a separate document. She requested that only specific individuals be present for this portion. Those individuals are James Montgomery, Eleanor Montgomery, William Montgomery, Catherine Montgomery, and Augusta Montgomery. My distant relatives looked confused, but began gathering their things. My mother's sister-in-law leaned over to whisper something to her, receiving only a tight smile in response. As the room cleared, leaving only my immediate family tension filled the air, Mr. Peterson took a sip of water before continuing. Now, regarding the bulk of Margaret Montgomery's estate, which includes the primary family residence, the majority of financial assets, and controlling interest in Montgomery Family Foundation. Before he could continue, my mother stood abruptly. Mr. Peterson, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. She turned to face me directly, her voice cutting through the room. Ungrateful ones are not allowed here. This portion concerns the family legacy, which Augusta has repeatedly rejected. The room fell silent. My father stared at the table, unwilling to meet my eyes. William shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Catherine studied her manicure with sudden interest. Mother, I have every right to be here, I said quietly, though my voice shook slightly. You gave up that right when you turned your back on this family, she replied coldly. Your grandmother may have indulged your rebellion out of sentimentality, but this is about the Montgomery legacy now. Humiliation burned through me as tears threatened to spill. I stood up, ready to leave with whatever dignity I could salvage. Fine. I never expected anything anyway. Miss Augusta, please remain seated, Mr. Peterson interrupted firmly. As executor of Mrs. Montgomery's will, I must insist that you stay. There are legal requirements that must be fulfilled with all named parties present. My mother's face flushed with anger. This is absurd. She has no interest in family responsibilities. She's made that abundantly clear for years. Nevertheless, Mrs. Montgomery's instructions were explicit. Mr. Peterson replied, his professional demeanor unshaken. If you wish to contest the will later, that is your prerogative. But for now, we will proceed as directed. Something in his tone made me sit back down. There was more happening here than a simple reading of bequests. My mother reluctantly returned to her seat, shooting daggers at me with her eyes. Mr. Peterson removed an envelope sealed with wax. Mrs. Montgomery left a letter to be read aloud at this point. These are her exact words. The room fell completely silent as Mr. Peterson broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter. I held my breath, noticing my mother's knuckles turn white as she gripped the edge of the table. My dear family, Mr. Peterson began reading in his measured tone. If this letter is being read, then I have passed from this world, leaving you to continue without my guidance. Over the years, I have watched our family with both pride and concern. Pride in the accomplishments and prosperity that each generation has built upon, but concern for the values that seem to have been lost along the way. My father shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Mr. Peterson continued. The Montgomery name has become synonymous with wealth and influence, but I fear it has come at the cost of compassion and authenticity. I have watched as pressure to conform to certain expectations has damaged relationships and stifled true potential. Most painfully, I have witnessed the treatment of my beloved granddaughter, Augusta. At the mention of my name, all eyes in the room turned toward me. My mother's face hardened, while my siblings looked suddenly alert. Augusta has shown courage that few possess, the courage to live according to her genuine passions rather than external expectations. For this, she has been ostracized, belittled, and made to feel unwelcome in her own family. I have observed this treatment in silence for too long, believing that eventually you would recognize her value. That was my mistake, and one I intend to correct now. My heart was pounding so loudly I was certain everyone could hear it. What was grandmother saying? Therefore, I have made the decision to divide my estate as follows. 50% of my total financial assets valued at approximately $28 million I leave directly to Augusta Montgomery with no conditions or restrictions. A collective gasp filled the room. My mother jumped to her feet. This is preposterous. She must have been confused or coerced. Augusta barely visited her. Mr. Peterson continued reading as if there had been no interruption. Additionally, I leave to Augusta my controlling interest in the Montgomery Family Foundation, making her the new chairperson effective immediately. This cannot be legal, my mother sputtered, her face now flushed with rage. She clearly wasn't of sound mind. Augusta has no experience managing such responsibilities. She's an artist, for God's sake. Mr. Peterson lowered the letter and fixed my mother with a stern gaze. Mrs. Montgomery. I can assure you that Margaret was of completely sound mind when she updated her will. In fact, anticipating this reaction, she took extraordinary measures to document her decision-making capacity. He reached into his briefcase and removed a thick folder. I have here signed statements from 3 separate psychiatrists confirming her mental competence, video recordings of our meetings discussing her wishes, and witnesses to the signing of these documents. Everything is in perfect legal order. I sat in stunned silence, unable to process what was happening. My grandmother had left me half her fortune and control of the family foundation. It seemed impossible. Mr. Peterson returned to the letter. I have watched Augusta forge her own path with integrity and determination. While others in the family have been content to live off inherited wealth, she has worked to create something meaningful. Her art may not have brought commercial success, but it has been honest and true. Values the Montgomery name once stood for. My brother William stared at me with a mixture of shock and what appeared to be newfound respect. Catherine's mouth hung slightly open, her perfect composure finally cracked. To the rest of my family, Mr. Peterson continued reading, I leave the remaining assets to be divided equally among you, with the hope that this decision will prompt reflection on what truly matters in life. It is not my intention to punish, but to correct a course that has veered far from the values that should define us. My mother laughed bitterly. This is absurd. Augusta clearly manipulated her when she was vulnerable. We'll contest this immediately. Mr. Peterson placed the letter down carefully. Mrs. Montgomery, before you pursue that course of action, there's additional documentation you should be aware of. He produced another folder containing photographs and what appeared to be a journal. Your mother kept detailed records of family interactions over the past decade. She documented 27 instances where Augusta attempted to visit or contact the family only to be rebuffed or ignored. She also kept records of who visited her during her illness. He handed me another sealed envelope. This is for you alone, Augusta. Your grandmother asked that you read it privately. My mother lunged forward. Whatever is in there concerns all of us. This is family business. For the first time, I found my voice. No, Mother. Grandmother wanted me to have this, and for once what she wanted will be respected. The shock of my assertiveness temporarily silenced her. I looked directly at Mr. Peterson. Is there anything else we need to discuss today? He nodded. Just one final stipulation regarding the foundation. Your grandmother specified that you must serve as chairperson for a minimum of 1 year before any changes to leadership can be considered. During that time, you have complete authority over grant-making and operations. My mother's face contorted with rage. This is outrageous. The foundation has been under Montgomery family control for generations. She can't possibly understand its importance or how to manage it. Actually, I said quietly, Grandmother and I discussed the foundation extensively. She was particularly interested in expanding its arts education programs for underprivileged children. The revelation that my grandmother and I had private conversations about the family foundation seemed to be the final straw for my mother. She stood up, gathering her purse with shaking hands. This is not over. We will fight this in court if necessary. She was clearly not in her right mind, and you took advantage of her. I met her gaze steadily. Grandmother made her own decisions, Mother, just as I have made mine. The difference is she respected mine even when she didn't fully understand them. Perhaps there's a lesson in that for all of us. As my family stormed out of the room in various states of shock and anger, I remained seated, the weight of my grandmother's trust settling on my shoulders. In a matter of minutes, my life had completely transformed. I wasn't just Augusta the disappointing artist anymore. I was Augusta Montgomery, heir to half the family fortune and the new leader of its philanthropic efforts. Mr. Peterson gathered his papers, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Your grandmother was quite a remarkable woman, Miss Augusta. She spoke of you often and with great pride. She believed you were the future of the Montgomery name, not despite your differences from the family, but because of them. For the first time since the reading began, tears spilled freely down my cheeks. Thank you, Mr. Peterson. I had no idea she was planning this. She wanted it that way, he replied kindly. She said surprise was sometimes necessary for truth to break through entrenched perspectives. Now shall we discuss the details of your inheritance? The next few hours passed in a blur, as Mr. Peterson explained the extent of my inheritance. Beyond the financial assets my grandmother had left me, her personal art collection, her private cottage on the family estate, and several journals documenting her life and observations. She had been planning this transfer of wealth and responsibility for over 3 years, methodically organizing everything to withstand any legal challenges. Your grandmother visited your studio in Brooklyn at least monthly, Mr. Peterson revealed to my astonishment. She kept detailed notes about your work and progress. She was particularly impressed by your installation on social inequality last year. She never mentioned seeing that exhibit, I said, amazed that my grandmother had been monitoring my career so closely without my knowledge. She was concerned that openly supporting you would cause more family conflict. Instead, she chose to help you in ways that would eventually be revealed through her will. As our meeting concluded, Mr. Peterson handed me a final envelope. This contains the keys to your grandmother's cottage and the access codes to her private safe. Inside, you'll find documents she wanted only you to see. Walking out of the library, I nearly collided with my mother, who had apparently been waiting in the hallway. Her perfect composure had crumbled, her eyes red-rimmed with either tears or rage, possibly both. Are you satisfied now? She demanded. You've managed to turn your grandmother against her own family in her final days. I took a deep breath, determined not to be drawn into her emotional manipulation. Mother, I had no idea about any of this. But grandmother made her own choices just as you've made yours over the years. What is that supposed to mean? She snapped. It means that every time you dismissed my art as a hobby, every time you excluded me from family events, every time you made me feel like I wasn't a real Montgomery, those were choices. Grandmother simply made different ones. She stepped closer, her voice low and threatening. This isn't over, Augusta. The foundation belongs to the family, not to some rebellious artist who doesn't understand our legacy. For the first time in my life, I didn't flinch under her intimidation. I understand more than you think, Mother. And legally, the foundation is now my responsibility. I intend to honor grandmother's vision for it. As she turned to storm away, my father approached cautiously. His expression showed conflicted emotions, the ingrained loyalty to my mother warring with what appeared to be genuine concern. Augusta, perhaps we can discuss this as a family, he suggested tentatively. Find a compromise that acknowledges your grandmother's wishes while preserving family harmony. I looked at him sadly, recognizing this familiar pattern, trying to smooth things over rather than address the real issues. Dad, where was this concern for family harmony when Mother was systematically pushing me out of the family for the past decade? He had no answer, his gaze dropping to the floor in silent acknowledgement of his complicity through inaction. As I prepared to leave, my brother William approached me in the driveway away from our parents' view. Augusta, wait, he called, jogging to catch up to me. Away from our mother's influence, he seemed less certain, less polished. I just wanted to say, I've always admired your courage, you know, taking your own path. I sometimes wished I had done the same. The admission stunned me. William had always seemed so perfectly content with his role as the Montgomery heir apparent. "You never said anything." He shrugged, looking uncomfortable. "It was easier not to, but for what it's worth, I think grandmother made the right choice. The foundation needs new vision, and you've always seen things differently than the rest of us." Before I could respond, he awkwardly patted my shoulder and walked away, leaving me to wonder if there might be more allies in my family than I had realized. My sister Catherine's reaction was more complex. I found her sitting alone on the garden bench, staring vacantly at our grandmother's rose bushes. "Congratulations on your windfall," she said, as I approached a mixture of bitterness and resignation in her tone. "You must be thrilled." "I'm overwhelmed," I admitted, sitting beside her. "I never expected any of this." She turned to study my face, perhaps looking for signs of deception. "You really didn't know." "No, I'm as shocked as everyone else." She was quiet for a moment, twisting her diamond wedding ring. "I always envied you, you know. Your freedom, your ability to just walk away from all the expectations." "It wasn't freedom, Catherine. It was exile," I replied softly. "And it hurt every single day." Something in my honest admission seemed to reach her. "I don't know what happens now," she said finally. "Mother is already calling her lawyers." "I know, but grandmother was careful. Mr. Peterson says everything is legally sound." Catherine nodded slowly. "She always was thorough." After a pause, she added, "What will you do with the foundation?" "Honor her vision for it," I said simply. "Which includes supporting arts education for children who wouldn't otherwise have access to it." A flicker of interest crossed her face. "That's actually something I might like to help with, if you're open to it." It was a small olive branch, but a significant one coming from my sister, who had always followed our mother's lead in family matters. "I'd like that," I replied, feeling the first tentative thread of reconnection. That evening, I returned to my small apartment in the city, the events of the day swirling in my mind. I sat on my worn sofa, surrounded by canvases and art supplies, trying to reconcile the struggling artist I had been that morning with the wealthy foundation chairperson I had suddenly become. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from extended family members, some congratulatory, others accusatory, depending on their allegiance to my mother. I silenced it, needing space to process. I opened my grandmother's personal letter with trembling hands. "My dearest Augusta, by now you know what I have done. Please understand that this decision was not made impulsively or without careful thought. I have watched you grow into a woman of principle and passion, choosing a difficult path because it was authentic rather than easy. The Montgomery legacy is not about money or social position, though many in the family have forgotten this. It is about integrity, vision, and using privilege to create positive change. You embody these values more than anyone else in the family, despite having been made to feel otherwise. The foundation needs your unique perspective. The family needs your compassion. And you, my dear girl, need to know that your path has always been valid and worthy of respect. There will be resistance. Stand firm in your truth. You are stronger than you know. With all my love, Grandmother Margaret." I clutched the letter to my chest, tears flowing freely. For the first time, I felt truly validated for the choices I had made. My grandmother had not only seen me, she had believed in me when no one else did. As I finally drifted off to sleep that night, I realized that while I had inherited wealth beyond my imagination, the true gift was the opportunity to reshape the Montgomery legacy into something that reflected values I could believe in. The weeks following my grandmother's will reading were a whirlwind of legal meetings, financial briefings, and thinly veiled hostility from my mother. As predicted, she filed a challenge to the will, claiming undue influence and diminished capacity. Her lawyers presented a case that portrayed me as a manipulative opportunist who had taken advantage of an elderly woman's sentimentality. Mr. Peterson calmly presented the extensive documentation my grandmother had prepared, including video recordings of her explicitly stating her reasoning. The judge dismissed the challenge within 3 weeks, leaving my mother fuming, and me with the sobering responsibility of managing millions of dollars and a significant charitable foundation. I decided to move into my grandmother's cottage on the family estate, a bold move that my mother protested vehemently but could not legally prevent. The cottage, though, on the property was separate from the main house with its own entrance and gardens. It had always been my grandmother's private retreat, and now it became mine. The first day I arrived with my modest belongings, Mrs. Jenkins, the housekeeper, greeted me with a warm hug. "Your grandmother would be so pleased," she whispered. "She talked about you living here someday. Said it would bring fresh air to this place." As I unpacked, I discovered little touches that suggested my grandmother had been preparing the space for me. An empty studio with north-facing windows perfect for painting shelves that seemed sized for my art books, even a cabinet containing high-quality art supplies still in their packaging. My mother's campaign against me extended beyond legal challenges. She systematically contacted family friends and associates, sharing her version of events that painted me as an ungrateful usurper. Invitations to social events suddenly dried up, and I received concerned calls from distant relatives questioning my intentions for the family foundation. Rather than fight these rumors directly, I focused on learning about the foundation my grandmother had entrusted to me. The Montgomery Family Foundation had historically funded traditional causes: hospital wings, symphony orchestras, Ivy League scholarships. While worthwhile, these contributions primarily benefited communities that already had significant resources. My first board meeting as chairperson was predictably tense. The board consisted primarily of family friends and business associates who had worked with my father and grandfather. They regarded me with barely concealed skepticism as I took my seat at the head of the table. "We understand you're new to this role," said Richard Harrington, a longtime board member and my father's golf partner. "Perhaps for the first year, you might simply observe how things have traditionally been run." I smiled politely. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Harrington. However, my grandmother appointed me chairperson, not observer. I've spent the past 3 weeks reviewing the Foundation's grant history, financial statements, and impact assessments." The surprise on their faces was evident. They had clearly expected me to be unprepared. "I've also discovered some interesting notes in my grandmother's private files," I continued. It seems she had been researching arts education programs in underserved communities for the past 2 years. I distributed folders containing proposals my grandmother had collected along with her handwritten notes. I believe she was moving toward a significant shift in the Foundation's focus. I intend to continue that work. The board erupted in protests, with members talking over each other about traditional priorities and established relationships. I let them vent before responding. The Foundation's mission statement, written by my great-grandfather, specifies enriching communities and creating opportunities for those without access. Nothing in that limits us to the same handful of elite institutions we've supported for decades. Gradually, I began to identify allies within the Foundation staff. Linda Michaels, the grants director, approached me after the meeting. "Your grandmother spoke to me about these programs last year," she confided. "She was particularly interested in how arts education improves academic outcomes in struggling schools. I have additional research if you're interested." These small connections helped me navigate the hostile environment my mother had created. I discovered that my grandmother had been far more strategic and forward-thinking than anyone had given her credit for. She had quietly built relationships with staff members who shared her vision, preparing the ground for changes she knew would face resistance. As I settled into my new role and home, I transformed the cottage to reflect both my grandmother's elegance and my own artistic sensibility. I converted the sunroom into a painting studio where natural light streamed in through windows overlooking the garden she had loved. Here, surrounded by memories of her, I began to paint again after weeks of creative paralysis following her death. One evening, as I was arranging my grandmother's art books, I discovered a false bottom in her antique desk drawer. Inside was a collection of newspaper clippings and gallery announcements from my exhibitions over the years. She had kept a record of every show, every review, every milestone in my career. Among these mementos was a folder containing receipts for purchases of my artwork. She had been anonymously buying my pieces through different galleries, supporting my career, while avoiding family conflict. The discovery brought fresh tears. I had never fully understood the complexity of her position, loving me and believing in my choices while navigating the delicate politics of the family she had married into. Her support had been more extensive and deliberate than I had ever realized. About a month after moving in, I was surprised by an unexpected visitor. My brother William arrived one evening, looking uncomfortable on my doorstep. "Nice place," he said awkwardly, looking around at the cottage I had begun to make my own. "More comfortable than the mausoleum." He referred to the main house with a wry smile I hadn't seen since we were children. I invited him in, curious about his visit. William had always been polite but distant, fully embracing his role as the Montgomery heir. "I've been thinking about what you said at the foundation meeting last week." He began, accepting the cup of tea I offered. "About arts programs improving academic outcomes in underperforming schools." "What about it?" I asked cautiously. "I did some research. The data is compelling." He pulled out several articles he had printed. "These results from similar programs in Chicago and Detroit are impressive. Test scores up 20%, attendance improved, even reduced behavioral issues." I studied my brother with newfound interest. "Since when do you research education programs?" He looked slightly embarrassed. "Since I started questioning things, I guess. After grandmother's will reading, it made me think about what she valued versus what we've been taught to value. I'm not saying Mother is wrong about everything, but maybe there's more than one way to approach the Montgomery legacy." This tentative alliance with my brother was unexpected, but welcome. Over the following weeks, he occasionally stopped by the cottage, usually with some business-related justification, but staying to discuss foundation matters or family history. Once, he even asked to see my latest paintings, showing genuine interest in understanding my work. My sister Catherine's shift was more gradual. Initially, she maintained a careful distance torn between loyalty to our mother and curiosity about the changes I was implementing. When I launched a pilot program for arts education in 3 local public schools, Catherine surprised me by volunteering to help coordinate with school administrators, leveraging her social connections for a purpose she actually found meaningful. "I never realized how much satisfaction could come from seeing direct impact," she confessed after watching a group of 5th graders proudly display their first art exhibition. "Mother's charity galas raise money, but you never really see where it goes or who it helps." My father's response was the most complex. After weeks of avoiding me entirely, he appeared at the cottage one rainy afternoon, looking older and more uncertain than I had ever seen him. "Your mother doesn't know I'm here," he said immediately after I opened the door. "She wouldn't approve." I invited him in, noticing how he studied the changes I had made to my grandmother's space. The paintings on the walls, the colorful throws over antique furniture, the blend of traditional and contemporary that somehow worked harmoniously together. "You've made it your own," he observed. "Margaret would like that. She always said spaces should evolve with the people who live in them." We sat in awkward silence before he finally spoke again. "I owe you an apology, Augusta. Many apologies, actually." I waited, giving him space to continue. "I should have stood up for you years ago. When you wanted to study art, when your mother cut you off from family events, when you were excluded from holidays." He stared at his hands. "I told myself I was keeping the peace, but really, I was just avoiding conflict. It was cowardice." The admission stunned me. My father had always seemed so confident, so certain of the family's prescribed path. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because your grandmother's choice forced me to see things differently. She was right about you having courage. It's made me question how much of my life has been lived according to expectations rather than genuine desires." He looked around the cottage again. "You seem more at peace here than I've ever felt in the main house despite all its grandeur." It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a beginning. My father was caught between decades of conformity and the first stirrings of admiration for a different way of living. Whether he would ever fully break free from my mother's influence remained to be seen. Meanwhile, my mother maintained her campaign of resistance. When she learned that I had redirected significant foundation funding from the Symphony Gala to arts programs in public schools, she attempted to rally board members to overrule me. When that failed, due to the legal authority my grandmother had given me, she turned to social pressure, organizing competing events when I scheduled foundation functions. Her most direct confrontation came when I announced the establishment of the Margaret Montgomery Arts Scholarship for underprivileged students showing promise in visual or performing arts. She appeared at my door, abandoning her weeks of calculated avoidance. "You're systematically dismantling everything this family has built," she accused, her voice tight with anger. "Using our name to fund finger painting for children who will never appreciate the opportunities you're squandering." I met her gaze steadily. "I'm expanding what this family can build, Mother. And these children appreciate the opportunity to express themselves more than you could possibly understand. Perhaps if you visited one of our programs instead of fighting them, you might see that." "Your grandmother made a terrible mistake," she said coldly. "One that will damage the Montgomery name for generations." "Or perhaps," I replied quietly, she recognized that the Montgomery name needed to stand for something more meaningful than social status and exclusive privilege. "Times change, Mother. Either we change with them or we become irrelevant." She left without another word, but I suspected our confrontation was far from over. My grandmother had given me the resources to stand my ground, but the emotional battle with my mother would likely continue indefinitely. Yet despite these ongoing tensions, I found myself thriving in ways I never expected. My artwork took on new depth as I processed the complex emotions of the past months. I began a series exploring family dynamics and inherited expectations that received positive attention from critics who had previously ignored my work. The Foundation's new initiatives gained traction with early results showing promising impacts in the communities we served. And slowly, I began building a network of relationships based on shared values rather than social obligations. One year after my grandmother's will reading, I stood in the gallery space I had created in the Foundation's headquarters, surrounded by artwork from students in our education programs. The exhibition opening marked a significant milestone, the first public display of what the reimagined Montgomery Foundation stood for. As I looked around at the proud student supportive parents and community members, I felt my grandmother's presence strongly. In one corner, surprisingly, stood my brother and sister, genuinely engaged in conversation with a teenage artist explaining her work. In another, a few board members who had initially resisted my changes now nodded approvingly at the obvious impact of our programs. And there at the entrance, wearing large sunglasses as if trying to remain incognito, was my mother. She hadn't spoken to me in weeks, and I hadn't expected her to attend. Our eyes met briefly across the room before she turned away, but the fact that she had come at all felt significant. Later that evening, back at the cottage, I opened the final package my grandmother had left for me, a collection of letters to be opened on the first anniversary of her passing. Her words seemed to speak directly to my current situation. "Family healing is neither quick nor simple, my dear Augusta. True change requires both firmness and patience. Some hearts will soften quickly when exposed to authenticity. Others may take years or never change at all. Your responsibility is not to force transformation, but to live your truth consistently and leave the door open for those ready to walk through it. As I looked out the window at the estate that had once felt like enemy territory, but was slowly becoming home again, I reflected on how much had changed in a year. The inheritance that had initially seemed like merely financial wealth had revealed itself to be something far more valuable. The opportunity to create meaningful change and to discover my own capacity for leadership and resilience. The journey ahead would not be easy. My mother's resistance would continue. The foundation would face ongoing challenges, and balancing my artistic career with my new responsibilities would require constant attention. But for the first time since my grandmother's passing, I felt genuinely optimistic about the future, both my own and the legacy she had entrusted to me. Today marks 1 year since the will reading that changed everything. As I stand in my studio watching the morning light filter through the windows of Grandmother Margaret's cottage, my cottage now, I can hardly believe how much has transformed in a single year. The Montgomery Family Foundation has been completely reimagined. Our arts education programs now serve 27 schools across 3 districts, reaching over 2,000 children who previously had no access to arts instruction. We've established the Margaret Montgomery Arts Scholarship, which sent its first 2 recipients to college this fall. Most importantly, we've shifted from being a foundation that simply wrote checks to one that builds real community partnerships. My own artistic career has flourished in unexpected ways. The series I began about family legacy and identity has received critical acclaim, with my first major gallery show opening next month. What surprises me most is how my art and foundation work have begun to inform each other, creating a harmonious balance rather than competing priorities. William has become my strongest ally within the family. After months of tentative support, he finally admitted that he had always felt trapped in the role of Montgomery heir. He's now pursuing an MBA with a focus on social enterprise, hoping to bridge the worlds of business and social impact. We meet weekly to discuss foundation strategy and occasionally just to enjoy each other's company as siblings should. Catherine's transformation has been more subtle but equally meaningful. While she maintains her social obligations, she's redirected her considerable organizational skills toward the foundation's community events. Last month, she confessed that for the first time in her adult life, she feels proud of her contributions rather than simply going through expected motions. My father visits the cottage regularly now, usually bringing some small gift: art books, interesting teas, or plants for the garden. We've developed a relationship independent of my mother, built on conversations about art philosophy and increasingly his own regrets about paths not taken. He remains married to my mother, but something has shifted in their dynamic. He speaks up more, disagrees occasionally, and has begun spending time on long-neglected personal interests. As for my mother, our relationship remains the most complex. Her initial legal challenges and social campaigns eventually gave way to a cold détente. She no longer actively fights my role, but maintains a careful distance. 3 months ago, something unexpected happened. She attended the Foundation's annual gala, which featured performances and exhibitions by students from our programs. She said nothing to me directly, but I noticed her watching intently as an 11-year-old girl from one of the city's poorest neighborhoods played a cello solo that brought tears to many eyes. Last week, I received a brief note from her requesting a meeting to discuss potential areas of collaboration. It wasn't an apology or recognition of my leadership, but it was an acknowledgement that the Foundation's new direction was here to stay. It's a small opening, but as Grandmother wrote in her final letter to me, healing happens in its own time. The most profound change, however, has been within myself. I no longer feel like the family disappointment or the excluded artist. I've found my voice as both a creative individual and a community leader. The validation I once desperately sought from my family has become less important, as I've built a life aligned with my values and surrounded myself with people who appreciate my authentic self. Among those people is Daniel, a community arts educator I met through the Foundation's programs. Unlike anyone I dated in the past, he understands both my creative passion and my commitment to social change. Our relationship is still new, but it's built on mutual respect and shared values rather than social expectations, a refreshing change from my previous experiences. Last night, I discovered a hidden compartment in my grandmother's desk containing a collection of her own artwork. Small, exquisite watercolors she had apparently created in private over many years. A note in her familiar handwriting read, "Art saved me too, Augusta. Some truths can only be expressed through creation." Finding this connection with her beyond the grave felt like her final gift. Confirmation that our bond went deeper than either of us had fully expressed in life. The journey hasn't been easy. There have been board meetings where I faced stubborn opposition, family gatherings still thick with tension, and moments of doubt about my ability to fulfill my grandmother's vision. But with each challenge, I've grown stronger and more certain of my path. My grandmother's words now hang framed in my studio. The truth will set things right. She knew that authenticity, while often difficult, is ultimately the only path to a meaningful life. By forcing my family to confront the truth of who I am and what I bring to our legacy, she created an opportunity for healing that none of us could have imagined. The greatest lesson I've learned is that true worth comes not from external validation or inherited position, but from living with integrity and using whatever privileges we have to create positive change. The Montgomery name now stands for something I can genuinely believe in. Not because I inherited it, but because I helped transform it. I often wonder what my grandmother would think of all we've accomplished this year. Sometimes in the quiet moments at sunset, when the light turns golden across her garden, I feel her presence and know she would be proud. Not just of the Foundation's work, but of my courage to stand firmly in my truth, despite tremendous pressure to conform. Have you ever had to stand up for your authentic self against family expectations? Or found yourself suddenly responsible for a legacy you never expected? Let me know in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who might need to hear that staying true to yourself is always worth the struggle. Thank you for listening to my journey. And remember, sometimes the path that feels like exile can lead to your greatest purpose.